The humidity pressed against his skin like a second uniform. Sergeant Michael Brennan wiped the sweat from his brow and stared into the green wall ahead, a dense, breathing mass of vegetation that seemed to swallow light itself. It was June 1967, somewhere in the central highlands of South Vietnam, and the air smelled of rotting leaves, diesel fuel, and something else he couldn't name. Something ancient, something watching. Behind him, 23 men from the 1st Cavalry Division waited in silence. Their M16 rifles gleamed with moisture, their helmets heavy with the tropical heat, their eyes scanning the tree line for any hint of movement. They had arrived in Vietnam with the confidence of a nation that had never lost a war. They carried with them the most advanced weaponry the world had ever seen. Automatic rifles, grenade launchers, radio equipment that could summon helicopters from the sky within minutes, and the promise of air support so devastating it could turn an entire hillside into ash. Brennan had been in country for 7 months, long enough to understand that the jungle didn't care about American technology, long enough to know that the enemy they faced didn't fight the way enemies were supposed to fight. He raised his hand, signaling the patrol to halt. Somewhere ahead, a bird called out, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the humid stillness. Or was it a bird? In this place, even the sounds lied. The United States military had entered Vietnam with a doctrine forged in the industrial furnaces of World War II and refined on the frozen hills of Korea. It was a doctrine built on overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and the systematic destruction of enemy forces through superior technology. The Pentagon's strategists had studied the maps, calculated the tonnage of bombs required, counted the helicopters and tanks and artillery pieces, and concluded that victory was a mathematical certainty. They had not counted on the jungle. The Vietnam War would become the proving ground for a fundamental question that had haunted military theorists since the invention of gunpowder. Could raw firepower alone win a war? The answer, written in blood across the highlands and rice paddies of Southeast Asia, would reshape American military thinking for generations. But on that morning in June 1967, Sergeant Brennan didn't know he was part of a historical lesson. He only knew that somewhere in the green darkness ahead, men were waiting to kill him. Men who didn't have helicopters or jets or artillery. Men who had been fighting in these jungles for 20 years, first against the Japanese, then the French, and now the Americans. Men who understood something that all the firepower in the world couldn't change. In the jungle, the rules were different. The patrol moved forward, single file, each man stepping carefully to avoid the tripwires and booby traps that the Viet Cong planted like seeds. Brennan's point man, a 19-year-old from Ohio named Danny Kowalski, moved with the exaggerated caution of someone who had learned the hard way that the ground itself could be an enemy. 3 weeks earlier, Kowalski had watched his best friend step on a pressure-activated mine hidden beneath a pile of leaves. The explosion had taken both of his friend's legs and most of his hope. Now Kowalski moved like a man walking through a minefield, because that's exactly what he was doing. Every step was a negotiation with death. Every breath was borrowed time. The American military had prepared extensively for the Vietnam conflict. The build-up had been systematic, methodical, and massive. By 1967, over 485,000 American troops were deployed in South Vietnam, supported by the most sophisticated logistics network ever assembled in a combat zone. Aircraft carriers patrolled the South China Sea, their decks crowded with fighter jets and bombers. B-52 Stratofortresses flew from bases in Guam and Thailand, each one capable of dropping over 30 tons of bombs in a single sortie. Artillery batteries dotted the countryside, their 155 mm howitzers able to hurl explosive shells over 14 miles. The numbers were staggering. In 1967 alone, American forces would drop more bomb tonnage on Vietnam than had been dropped on all of Europe during World War II. The theory was simple: find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with overwhelming firepower. It was called Search and Destroy, and it represented the pinnacle of American military thinking, a doctrine that assumed superior technology would always triumph over inferior numbers. The Vietnamese, however, had their own doctrine. It had been developed over centuries of fighting foreign invaders, refined through decades of guerrilla warfare, and perfected in the crucible of the First Indochina War against France. It was a doctrine that didn't seek to match American firepower, but to negate it entirely. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of the Vietnamese resistance, understood something that Pentagon planners had overlooked. In asymmetric warfare, the weaker force doesn't need to win battles, it only needs to survive them. Time, patience, and the will to endure were weapons more powerful than any bomb. Brennan's patrol reached a small clearing and he called for a halt. The men spread out automatically, creating a defensive perimeter, while the radio operator called in their position. Standard procedure. Everything by the book. The American military ran on procedure. Checklists, protocols, doctrines. There was a right way to do everything, and that right way had been developed, tested, and approved by men with stars on their shoulders and degrees from West Point. The jungle didn't read the manual. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Kowalski dropped without a sound, a neat hole appearing in the center of his forehead. Before Brennan could shout a warning, the tree line erupted with automatic weapons fire, and the world became chaos. This was the reality of combat in Vietnam, not the set-piece battles of World War II, not the linear confrontations of Korea, but something older and more primal. Ambush warfare, hit and run, strike from the shadows and disappear before the overwhelming American firepower could respond. Brennan threw himself behind a fallen log, his M16 already returning fire at muzzle flashes he could barely see. Around him, his men were doing the same, shooting at ghosts, at shadows, at an enemy that seemed to materialize from the vegetation itself. He grabbed the radio handset and screamed for air support. Within minutes, he knew helicopter gunships would arrive. Within an hour, if necessary, jets could reduce this entire section of jungle to smoking craters. That was the American way. That was supposed to be the winning formula, but the enemy knew the formula too. By the time the first Huey gunship arrived, its door gunners spraying the tree line with M60 machine gun fire, the ambush was over. The Viet Cong had melted back into the jungle, carrying their dead and wounded with them, leaving behind only spent brass casings and the bodies of 4 American soldiers. Brennan stood in the clearing, his hands shaking, and stared at the wall of green that had swallowed his enemy. The helicopter's rotors beat the air above him, stirring the leaves into a temporary frenzy, but the jungle remained impassive, untouched, waiting. He had called in the firepower. It had arrived exactly as promised, and it had accomplished nothing. This scene, this exact moment of frustration and futility, would repeat itself thousands of times across Vietnam. American units would walk into ambushes, call for support, and watch as billions of dollars worth of ordnance tore apart empty jungle. The enemy was never where the bombs fell. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, as elusive as smoke, as patient as stone. The fundamental disconnect between American strategy and Vietnamese reality was becoming evident to the men on the ground long before it registered in Washington. Firepower required a target. Bombs needed something to destroy. But how do you destroy an enemy that refuses to stand still? How do you win a war against an opponent who measures victory not in territory captured, but in days survived? Brennan didn't know the answers. He only knew that 4 of his men were dead, that the enemy had escaped, and that tomorrow they would do this all over again. Walk into the jungle, spring another ambush, call in more firepower, watch the enemy disappear. The weight of his certainty, The absolute faith in American military supremacy that he had carried into this war was beginning to crack. And in that crack, doubt was taking root. The helicopter lifted the bodies of the fallen, their ponchos wrapped tight against the rotor wash. Brennan watched them rise above the canopy and disappear toward the east, toward the field hospitals and morgues that processed American casualties with industrial efficiency. He looked back at the jungle. It hadn't changed. It would never change. It had been here for millions of years, and it would be here long after the last American soldier went home. The bombs, the napalm, the defoliants, they were temporary wounds on something ancient and patient. The jungle was waiting, and in the tunnels beneath Brennan's feet, in the villages he would never find, in the networks of trails and caches that honeycombed the highlands, the enemy was waiting too. They had time. They had patience. They had something that no amount of firepower could destroy. They had the jungle. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you want to understand how wars are truly won and lost, not through propaganda, but through the raw truth of strategy and human endurance, then subscribe now. This story is just beginning. To understand what happened in Vietnam, one must first understand what America brought to the fight. The arsenal assembled for this conflict represented the accumulated knowledge of industrial warfare. Every lesson from 2 world wars and Korea distilled into weapons of unprecedented precision and destructive power. The centerpiece of American ground forces was the M16 rifle. Lightweight, air-cooled and capable of firing over 700 rounds per minute on full automatic, it was designed to give the individual soldier firepower that previous generations couldn't have imagined. A single infantryman in Vietnam carried more killing potential than an entire squad in World War I. But the M16 was just the beginning. The M60 machine gun provided sustained automatic fire at the squad level. The M79 grenade launcher allowed soldiers to drop explosive rounds on enemy positions up to 400 meters away. The M72 Law rocket could destroy bunkers and light vehicles. Claymore mines created killing zones that could eliminate entire enemy assault waves in a single detonation. Above the infantry, the helicopter transformed warfare in ways that strategists were still struggling to comprehend. The UH-1 Iroquois, the legendary Huey, became the symbol of the Vietnam War. Its distinctive rotor sound, the heartbeat of American operations. These machines could insert troops deep into enemy territory, extract the wounded within minutes, and provide close air support with door-mounted machine guns and rocket pods. The AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter took airborne firepower to another level. Armed with a 20mm cannon, rockets, and guided missiles, a single Cobra could devastate an enemy position with surgical precision. For the first time in history, infantry could call upon flying gun platforms that could respond within minutes, day or night, in almost any weather. But helicopters were just the opening act of American air power. The fighter bombers of the Air Force and Navy turned the sky into a canvas of destruction. F-4 Phantoms screamed over the jungle at supersonic speeds, delivering bombs, napalm, and cluster munitions with increasing accuracy. F-105 Thunder Chiefs carried out deep strikes into North Vietnam, challenging one of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world. A-1 Sky Raiders, propeller-driven relics that should have been obsolete, proved devastatingly effective at close air support, loitering over battlefields for hours and delivering ordnance with pinpoint accuracy. And then there were the B-52s. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress was designed to carry nuclear weapons across continents and end civilization in a single afternoon. In Vietnam, these strategic bombers were repurposed for a different kind of apocalypse. Flying at 30,000 feet, so high they couldn't be seen or heard from the ground, A formation of B-52s could release over 100 bombs in a single pass, obliterating everything within a rectangular area a mile long and half a mile wide. The Vietnamese called them Whispering Death. The first warning was the bombs themselves, already falling when the sound of the aircraft finally reached the ground. Those caught in an arc-light strike, the operational codename for B-52 missions, described the experience as being inside an earthquake and a thunderstorm simultaneously. The concussion waves alone could kill, rupturing internal organs even when the bombs landed hundreds of meters away. Artillery provided the constant drumbeat beneath this symphony of destruction. American fire support bases dotted the Vietnamese landscape, their 105 and 155 howitzers able to deliver high-explosive rounds within minutes of a call for fire. The 175 guns could reach targets over 20 miles away, while multiple rocket launchers could saturate entire grid squares with explosives in a single volley. The Navy contributed its own firepower from offshore. Battleships and cruisers pounded coastal positions with shells weighing as much as small cars. Aircraft carriers launched hundreds of sorties daily, their air wings maintaining a tempo of operations that would have been impossible in any previous conflict. And underlying all of this was the most sophisticated logistics system ever deployed in warfare. The United States military in Vietnam consumed supplies at a rate that would have bankrupted most nations. Ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies. A river of materiel flowed from American ports to Vietnamese bases, sustaining an operation of almost incomprehensible scale. By 1968, the United States was spending over $2 billion per month on the Vietnam War. The tonnage of bombs dropped would eventually exceed 7 million, more than 3 times the total dropped by all sides in World War II. The helicopter fleet alone flew over 36 million sorties during the conflict. The numbers beggar imagination. This was the arsenal of democracy, refined by industrial capitalism into an instrument of pure destruction. On paper, in war games, in the calculations of Pentagon strategists, this force was invincible. No guerrilla army, no matter how dedicated, could stand against such overwhelming power. The theory was sound, the math was correct, and yet something was terribly wrong. The problem emerged slowly, in after-action reports that didn't quite add up, in body counts that seemed impressive but led to no strategic progress, in maps that showed controlled territory but couldn't explain why the enemy kept appearing in areas supposedly pacified. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, who led American forces in the brutal Ia Drang Valley battles of 1965, later articulated the disconnect with painful clarity. His men had fought with extraordinary courage. They had called in massive airstrikes and artillery barrages. They had killed North Vietnamese soldiers by the hundreds, and in the end, they had achieved nothing permanent. The enemy simply withdrew, reconstituted, and returned. The American military was fighting a war of attrition, attempting to kill enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced. The assumption was that at some point the Vietnamese would run out of men willing to die. The assumption was wrong. North Vietnam's leadership had made a calculation that American strategists fundamentally misunderstood. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap had accepted that they would lose every major battle. They had accepted that their forces would suffer casualties far exceeding American losses. What they would not accept was defeat. Their strategy was simple: endure, absorb the firepower, replace the losses, wait for American public opinion to turn. The Vietnamese had been fighting for their independence for over 1,000 years. They could wait for another decade, another generation if necessary. Against this patience, American firepower was like water against stone. Powerful, yes. Impressive, certainly, but ultimately ineffective against something that simply refused to break. The arithmetic that governed American strategy, kill ratios, sortie rates, tonnage delivered, measured everything except what actually mattered. It couldn't quantify Vietnamese determination. It couldn't calculate the depth of nationalist sentiment that drove young men to march down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, knowing that most of them would never return. It couldn't factor in the simple truth that people fighting for their homeland will endure suffering that no statistical model can predict. Major General William Dupuy, one of the architects of search and destroy tactics, would later admit the fundamental flaw in American thinking. "We were not fighting the war we were trained to fight," he said. "We were fighting something else entirely. That something else was a war where firepower was necessary but not sufficient. A war where controlling the air meant nothing if you couldn't control the ground. A war where the enemy's center of gravity wasn't a capital city or an industrial base, but the will of a people." The American military had brought the most sophisticated killing machine in human history to Vietnam. What they discovered was that some things cannot be killed by bombs. Private First Class James Woodson arrived in Vietnam in March 1968, 3 months after the Tet Offensive had shattered American illusions of progress. He was 19 years old, raised in rural Georgia, and had never seen a jungle except in movies. Within 48 hours of arriving at his unit's base camp, he would receive an education that no training could provide. His platoon sergeant, a weathered staff sergeant named Rodriguez, who was on his second tour, took Woodson aside on his first morning in the field. "Forget everything they taught you at Fort Polk," Rodriguez said. "Out here, the jungle makes the rules." Woodson didn't understand. He had trained for months. He knew his weapon, his tactics, his role in the squad. He was ready. Rodriguez smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The jungle doesn't care what you know, Private. It only cares what you learn." The education began immediately. The first lesson was about sound. In the dense vegetation of Vietnam, visual range often extended no more than 20 or 30 meters. The jungle reduced warfare to a claustrophobic nightmare where enemies might be invisible at arm's length. What you could see mattered far less than what you could hear. The jungle had its own soundtrack: bird calls, insect chirps, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the drip of moisture from the canopy. American soldiers learned to listen beneath this constant noise for the sounds that didn't belong. The metallic click of a weapon being charged, the soft crack of a twig under a footstep, the absence of bird calls in an area where they should be singing. The Viet Cong understood this acoustic warfare intimately. They trained their soldiers to move in silence, to communicate through hand signals and bird calls, to become part of the jungle's natural rhythm. An American patrol might pass within meters of an ambush and never know it until the bullets started flying. The second lesson was about the ground itself. Vietnam's terrain was a nightmare for conventional operations. Triple canopy jungle blocked aerial observation and turned movement into an exhausting struggle through vines and undergrowth. Mountains rose suddenly from valley floors, their slopes covered in vegetation so thick that helicopter landing zones had to be blasted into existence with bombs. Rice paddies created open killing grounds where any movement was visible for miles. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had adapted to this terrain over years of warfare. They moved primarily at night, when American air power was less effective. They used trails that wound through the densest vegetation, invisible from above. They dug tunnels, vast underground complexes that could shelter entire battalions and that defied conventional assault. The tunnel systems of Cu Chi, northwest of Saigon, became legendary. Over 200 kilometers of underground passages connected chambers used as hospitals, ammunition depots, command centers, and living quarters. American forces would clear an area, declare it pacified, and move on, while beneath their feet, enemy soldiers lived and operated with impunity. The tunnels weren't just shelters, they were weapons. Trapdoors concealed in the jungle floor allowed guerrillas to appear behind American patrols, fire a few shots, and vanish underground before any response could be organized. Tunnel openings were booby-trapped, their narrow passages lined with spikes and explosives, making them death traps for any American soldier foolish enough to enter. A specialized unit, the Tunnel Rats, eventually developed to clear these underground labyrinths. Armed only with pistols, flashlights, and knives, these volunteers crawled into the darkness, never knowing what waited around the next corner. It was perhaps the most terrifying duty in Vietnam, and it accomplished remarkably little against a tunnel network that seemed to regenerate faster than it could be destroyed. The third lesson was about time. American operations ran on schedules. Patrols left at designated hours. Supply runs occurred on predictable patterns. Artillery fire missions required coordination through multiple command layers. Everything operated on military time, synchronized and standardized. The enemy operated on different time, patient time, organic time, time measured not in hours, but in opportunities. They could wait in ambush positions for days, surviving on cold rice and rainwater until the perfect moment presented itself. They could observe American patterns for weeks, learning the rhythms of patrols and guard changes before striking with sudden violence. This patience drove American commanders to frustration. Search and destroy operations would sweep through an area, finding nothing. Units would return to base, report the area clear, and within days, intelligence would confirm that enemy forces had returned. It was like trying to grip water. General William Westmoreland, commander of American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, never fully solved this problem. His strategy of attrition assumed that aggressive operations would force the enemy to fight on American terms, where superior firepower would prevail. But the enemy refused to cooperate. The Vietnamese commanders chose their battles. They attacked when conditions favored them and melted away when American firepower materialized. They accepted tactical defeats in exchange for strategic survival. They understood something that Westmoreland's statistical models couldn't capture. In guerrilla warfare, not losing is winning. Woodson learned these lessons through experience, through ambushes where friends died screaming, through endless patrols that found nothing, through the slow erosion of confidence that combat inflicts on young men. He learned that the M16, for all its theoretical firepower, jammed constantly in the humid conditions of Vietnam. The weapon's tight tolerances, perfect for a controlled environment, became a liability in the mud and moisture of the jungle. Soldiers died with jammed rifles in their hands, victims of a design flaw that took years to correct. He learned that the sophisticated radio equipment that was supposed to guarantee communication often failed in the dense vegetation. Mountains blocked signals, humidity corroded contacts, units found themselves isolated, unable to call for the fire support that was supposed to be their advantage. He learned that helicopters, miraculous as they were, couldn't fly in all conditions. Monsoon rains grounded air operations for days at a time. Morning fog reduced visibility to zero. During these periods, infantry units were on their own, fighting the same close-quarters battles that soldiers had fought for centuries. Most importantly, he learned about fear. The Vietnam jungle was designed by evolution to conceal predators. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every step might trigger a trap. The constant tension of operating in this environment eroded men's psychological reserves with relentless efficiency. Some soldiers developed what psychologists would later call hypervigilance, a state of perpetual alertness that prevented rest, degraded judgment, and slowly destroyed mental health. Others went the opposite direction, becoming fatalistic, convinced that death was inevitable and that caution was pointless. The army had no framework for addressing this psychological damage. The 12-month rotation policy meant that soldiers arrived, experienced trauma, and rotated home before anyone could assess the long-term impact. The full cost of jungle warfare on American mental health wouldn't be understood for decades. Woodson survived his tour. Many of his friends didn't. When he finally boarded the plane that would carry him home, he looked down at the green carpet of jungle disappearing beneath the clouds and felt nothing he could name. Relief, certainly, but also something else. A recognition that he was leaving a place that had changed him in ways he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. The jungle had taught him its rules. The lesson had cost him his innocence, his faith in American invincibility, and parts of himself that he would never recover. But he had learned. If this story resonates with something deep inside you, if you feel the weight of sacrifice and the complexity of history pressing against your heart, then pause for a moment and type in the comments, "The jungle remembers what we try to forget." Let those who come after know that this story mattered to someone. By 1969, the American military had deployed technologies in Vietnam that seemed to come from science fiction. Electronic sensors dropped along the Ho Chi Minh Trail detected the vibrations of truck convoys and the scent of human sweat. Computers processed this data and directed airstrikes within minutes. Night vision devices turned darkness into green-tinted daylight. Precision-guided munitions promised to put bombs exactly where they needed to go. This was the future of warfare, a systems analysis approach that treated combat as an engineering problem to be solved through better technology and more data. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense for much of the war, personified this thinking. A former president of Ford Motor Company, McNamara believed that the tools that had revolutionized American industry could do the same for American warfare. The result was a transformation in how the military understood itself. Every aspect of the Vietnam War was measured, quantified, and analyzed. Body counts became the primary metric of success, reducing the complexity of guerrilla warfare to a simple number that could be tracked on charts and reported to Congress. Computers calculated optimal bombing patterns. Operations research teams developed models predicting enemy behavior. The electronic barrier along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, codenamed Operation Igloo White, represented the pinnacle of this technological approach. Thousands of sensors, disguised as vegetation or buried in the ground, created an invisible surveillance network across the infiltration routes from North Vietnam. When sensors detected movement, data flowed to a massive analysis center in Thailand, where computers correlated the information and directed airstrikes against the moving targets. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a costly failure. The Vietnamese learned to trigger the sensors deliberately, sending American aircraft to bomb empty jungle while supply convoys moved through alternative routes. They discovered that the seismic sensors could be fooled by herding water buffalo through an area. They developed tactics to exploit the delay between detection and response, moving supplies in quick bursts that were finished before bombs could arrive. The electronic battlefield consumed billions of dollars and achieved remarkably little. The Ho Chi Minh Trail continued to function throughout the war, delivering men and material to the South despite everything American technology could throw at it. Similar patterns emerged across the technological spectrum. Night vision equipment gave American forces an advantage in darkness, but the enemy adapted by moving during twilight hours or under heavy cloud cover when the devices were less effective. They learned to use decoys, to create diversions, to exploit the limitations that every technology inevitably possesses. Precision-guided munitions, still in their infancy, offered hope of reducing the indiscriminate destruction of conventional bombing. But the jungle canopy defeated laser guidance systems, and the dense vegetation prevented accurate damage assessment. Bomb after bomb disappeared into the green, and no one could say with certainty what, if anything, had been destroyed. The most toxic technological innovation was Agent Orange, and the other defoliants sprayed across Vietnam. The theory was sound. Remove the jungle canopy, and the enemy loses his cover. Operation Ranch Hand ultimately sprayed over 19 million gallons of herbicides across South Vietnam, stripping millions of acres of vegetation and exposing the countryside to observation from above. The ecological devastation was immense. Entire ecosystems destroyed, farmland poisoned, groundwater contaminated. The human cost proved even greater. Agent Orange contained dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds known to science. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians were exposed, suffering elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and other health catastrophes that continue to this day. American soldiers who handled the chemicals or operated in sprayed areas would later develop their own health crises, fighting for decades to receive recognition and compensation. And the military effectiveness? The enemy adapted. They dispersed, moved at night, used underground facilities. The defoliation created fields of fire and improved observation, but it didn't defeat the insurgency. It simply added another layer of tragedy to a conflict already drowning in suffering. The technology trap was fundamentally about misunderstanding the nature of the war. American planners assumed that better tools would solve the problem, that enough data and enough precision and enough firepower would eventually overwhelm enemy resistance. They treated Vietnam as a technical challenge, susceptible to technical solutions. What they faced was a political and human problem that technology could not address. The Vietnamese people were not fighting because they had superior weapons or tactics. They were fighting because foreign forces occupied their country, first the French, now the Americans. No sensor could detect the depth of that motivation. No computer could calculate the staying power of nationalist sentiment. No bomb could destroy an idea. Captain David Harris, an intelligence officer who served in Vietnam during 1969 and 1970, later wrote about the fundamental disconnect between American analysis and Vietnamese reality. "We knew everything," he observed, "except what mattered. We could count trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and estimate rice production in enemy-held areas and calculate probable infiltration rates. What we couldn't understand was why they kept coming. Our models had no variable for belief. The technology trap extended beyond the battlefield to the very way America fought the war. Because the military could measure body counts and sortie rates and bombs delivered, it focused on those metrics. Because it couldn't measure Vietnamese morale, or the political legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government, or the effectiveness of pacification efforts, it discounted those factors. The result was a kind of strategic blindness. Commanders optimized for what could be measured, even when what could be measured wasn't what mattered. The data said the war was being won, the reality said otherwise. By the time this disconnect became undeniable, it was too late. The technological approach had consumed years and billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives, and the fundamental situation remained unchanged. The enemy was still there, still fighting, still willing to absorb whatever punishment America could deliver. The machines had performed exactly as designed. The sensors had detected, the computers had calculated, the bombs had exploded, and none of it had been enough. The war was not lost because American technology failed. The war was lost because American strategy assumed technology could substitute for political legitimacy and popular support. It was a lesson that would echo through subsequent conflicts, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in every place where the world's most powerful military discovered that there are some problems firepower cannot solve. The statistics of the Vietnam War reduce human beings to numbers. 58 to 220 American dead, over 1 million Vietnamese soldiers killed, perhaps 2 million civilians lost to violence, disease, and displacement. The numbers are necessary for historical understanding, but they can obscure the reality they represent. Each digit in those statistics was a person, someone with dreams and fears, family and friends, a life interrupted by forces beyond their control. Captain Maria Santos, an army nurse who served at the 24th Evacuation Hospital in Long Bin during 1970, remembered the human cost with searing clarity decades later. The helicopters came every day, she recalled, sometimes every hour. Boys who should have been in college, learning to become men. Instead, they were learning how bodies break. The wounds of Vietnam were unlike anything American medicine had previously confronted. The explosive power of mines and booby traps produced devastating injuries, amputations, burns, internal damage that challenged even the best surgeons. The jungle environment bred infections that turned minor wounds into life-threatening conditions. The intensity of combat, combined with rapid helicopter evacuation, meant that soldiers survived injuries that would have been fatal in any previous war. Survived, but often with catastrophic disabilities. Santos watched young men arrive in her hospital, their bodies shattered, their minds struggling to process what had happened to them. Some recovered, some didn't. All were changed forever. The Army's medical system saved lives with remarkable efficiency. Over 98% of wounded soldiers who reached a hospital survived. But the survival rates concealed a deeper truth. Thousands of these survivors would spend the rest of their lives dealing with amputations, traumatic brain injuries, and the invisible wounds of psychological trauma. For those who escaped physical injury, the psychological burden was often equally devastating. Combat in Vietnam demanded a level of constant vigilance that eroded mental health with inexorable pressure. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Civilians might be hostile. The ground itself was treacherous. There was no front line, no safe area, no moment of genuine relaxation. Sergeant Robert Chen, who served as an infantry squad leader during 1968 and 1969, described the cumulative weight of this stress. After a few months, you weren't really yourself anymore. You had become something else. Harder, more suspicious, always watching. The jungle took the person you were and replaced it with someone who could survive. But that survival came at a cost. Chen made it home physically intact, but the hypervigilance that kept him alive in Vietnam didn't turn off when he stepped off the plane in California. He found himself scanning rooftops for snipers in suburban neighborhoods, flinching at car backfires, unable to sit with his back to a door. The war had rewired his nervous system, and decades would pass before he understood why. The military of that era had no vocabulary for what Chen and thousands like him were experiencing. Shell shock from World War I had become combat fatigue in World War II and Korea, temporary conditions that rest would cure. The idea that combat could cause permanent psychological damage was barely acknowledged, and the soldiers suffering from it were often dismissed as weak or malingering. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be formally recognized until 1980, 5 years after the last American combat troops left Vietnam. By then, tens of thousands of veterans were struggling with symptoms that no one had told them to expect. Nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbness, explosive anger, an inability to connect with people who hadn't shared their experience. The damage extended beyond individual soldiers to entire families and communities. Veterans returned to a nation deeply divided over the war, often finding hostility instead of gratitude, confusion instead of understanding. Many withdrew into isolation, unable to bridge the gap between their experiences and civilian comprehension. Divorce rates among Vietnam veterans soared, substance abuse became epidemic, suicide claimed lives for decades after the war ended. The full toll of psychological casualties would never be calculated, but it certainly numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a hidden cost of war that no body count could capture. For Vietnamese civilians, the human dimension was even more devastating. They lived in a war zone for over a decade, caught between forces that viewed them alternately as resources to be won or threats to be neutralized. Nguyen Thi Lan was 17 when American forces arrived in her village in 1965. By the time they left in 1973, she had lost her father to a bombing raid, her brother to conscription into the South Vietnamese army, and her home to the displacement that affected millions of Vietnamese during the conflict. "We were pawns," she remembered years later. "The Americans came with promises of democracy and modernization. The Viet Cong came with promises of land and independence. All we wanted was to be left alone, to farm our rice and raise our families. But no one asked us what we wanted." Her story was replicated across Vietnam, in villages burned as suspected enemy strongholds, in cities swelled with refugees, in families torn apart by a conflict that recognized no neutrality. The civilian death toll remains disputed, but even conservative estimates suggest that Vietnamese non-combatants died at a rate of 10 or more for every American soldier killed. The destruction of Vietnamese society extended beyond immediate casualties. Traditional village structures were disrupted by forced relocations. Agricultural systems collapsed under the pressure of warfare. Unexploded ordnance contaminated farmland, continuing to kill and maim decades after the last bomb was dropped. The environmental damage from defoliants and bombing would persist for generations. The human dimension of the Vietnam War resists simple conclusions. American soldiers, by and large, did what they were asked to do with courage and professionalism. They fought in impossible conditions against a skilled and determined enemy, believing they were serving their country and defending freedom. That many returned home disillusioned and damaged reflects the nature of the war they were sent to fight, not any failure on their part. The Vietnamese, on all sides, suffered on a scale that Americans rarely acknowledge. Their country became a battlefield for global powers, and they paid the price in blood and suffering that continues to shape their nation today. Their resilience in the face of this destruction speaks to something fundamental about human endurance. What the human dimension reveals, ultimately, is that wars are not fought by nations or ideologies. They are fought by people, individuals with names and faces, families and futures. The firepower that America deployed to Vietnam was measured in tonnage and sorties and dollars spent. The cost it imposed was measured in human lives, and that cost defied any calculation the Pentagon could produce. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973, following the Paris Peace Accords that promised peace with honor. 2 years later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets of Saigon, and the war that had consumed American attention for over a decade reached its final, unambiguous conclusion. The South Vietnamese government fell. The country was unified under communist rule. Everything American soldiers had fought and died for was erased in a matter of weeks. The aftermath was bitter beyond description. In the immediate years following the fall of Saigon, America tried to forget Vietnam. The war had torn the nation apart, divided families, shattered trust in government institutions, and challenged fundamental assumptions about American power and purpose. The collective response was avoidance, a national turning away from a wound too painful to examine. Veterans found themselves invisible, their service unacknowledged, their sacrifices unremarked. The parades and celebrations that had welcomed previous generations home were absent. In their place was silence, discomfort, and sometimes outright hostility. The men who had served in Vietnam were left to process their experiences alone, without the social support that previous wars had provided. But history doesn't forgive forgetting. The lessons of Vietnam were written in blood, and they would eventually demand attention. The first lesson concerned the limitations of firepower. The United States had demonstrated in Vietnam that it could destroy virtually anything it could identify and target. Bombs could flatten cities, defoliants could strip jungles, napalm could incinerate entire grid squares. The capacity for destruction was essentially unlimited. What firepower could not do was build. It couldn't create political legitimacy for an unpopular government. It couldn't win the loyalty of a population that saw foreign troops as invaders. It couldn't substitute for the hard, slow work of addressing the grievances that fueled insurgency. The military had been asked to solve a political problem with military tools, and it had failed. Not because the tools were inadequate, but because they were the wrong tools for the job. The second lesson concerned the importance of understanding the enemy. American strategists had consistently underestimated Vietnamese determination and misunderstood Vietnamese motivations. They had assumed that enough pain would break the enemy's will, that rational calculations would eventually lead Hanoi to negotiate on American terms. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Vietnamese were fighting for their homeland, for national unity, for an end to foreign domination that had lasted in various forms for over a century. This was not a motivation that body counts could erode or bombing campaigns could destroy. The failure to understand this fundamental truth led to strategic decisions based on false assumptions with predictably disastrous results. The third lesson concerned the relationship between military action and political objectives. In Vietnam, the military had often operated on the assumption that destroying enemy forces would automatically advance political goals. But military success and political success are not the same thing. Winning battles while losing popular support is a recipe for ultimate defeat. The disconnect between military metrics and political reality had allowed the war to continue long past the point where victory was possible. Commanders reported progress because their indicators showed progress. Enemy dead, territory swept, hamlets pacified. But these indicators measured the wrong things, and the war was lost while Washington congratulated itself on tactical successes. The fourth lesson concerned the limits of technological solutions to human problems. The Vietnam War had been a testing ground for sophisticated systems and innovative technologies, and these had consistently failed to deliver promised results. Not because the technology didn't work, but because the problem wasn't technological. No sensor could detect political will. No computer could model cultural resistance. No precision-guided munition could destroy an idea. The fifth lesson concerned the cost of war, not just in dollars and equipment, but in human suffering. The physical and psychological casualties of Vietnam would burden American society for generations. The Vietnamese would spend decades recovering from devastation that scarred their land and traumatized their population. War is not an abstract policy option. It is organized violence with consequences that ripple outward forever. These lessons were not immediately absorbed. The military establishment, humiliated by defeat, was reluctant to examine its failures too closely. Politicians who had supported the war were disinclined to admit error. The public wanted to move on. But the lessons survived in the experiences of those who had served, in the analyses of scholars who studied the conflict, in the institutional memory of a military that had been forced to confront its limitations. When America next faced insurgency, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the ghosts of Vietnam would be present, offering warnings that were sometimes heeded and sometimes ignored. Sergeant Michael Brennan, who had watched his men die in that ambush in the Central Highlands in 1967, eventually wrote his own assessment of what Vietnam had taught him. He published it in a small veterans magazine in 1985, where it was read by a few hundred people and then forgotten. But his words captured something essential. We had everything. The helicopters, the jets, the artillery, the technology. We had so much firepower, we could have turned the whole country into a parking lot. And it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Because you can't bomb people into wanting what you want them to want. You can't helicopter in democracy. You can't napalm your way to hearts and minds. We learned that lesson the hard way. We learned it in blood, theirs and ours. The question is whether we'll remember it the next time someone tells us that firepower is the answer. The jungle stands today, where Brennan's patrol was ambushed, green and dense and indifferent to human memory. The bombs that fell there have long since been absorbed into the soil. The bodies that lay in those clearings are bones now, scattered and forgotten. Life has returned to places that were once defined by death, but the lessons remain, waiting to be remembered or forgotten, waiting to save lives or be learned again at the same terrible cost. Vietnam was not the last time American firepower would meet the limits of the jungle, or the desert, or the mountains, or any other terrain where determined people refused to accept defeat. The pattern would repeat again and again, because the fundamental truth that Vietnam revealed is uncomfortable, inconvenient, and difficult to accept. Some problems cannot be solved with bombs. Some enemies cannot be defeated by technology. Some wars cannot be won by firepower alone. The jungle knew this. The jungle had always known this. And somewhere in the green depths, where the shadows are eternal and the silence is patient, the jungle still remembers. It remembers the sound of helicopters that came too late. It remembers the explosions that destroyed everything except what mattered. It remembers the young men who came from a distant land, with all the power in the world, and discovered that power was not enough. The jungle remembers, and it waits with the patience of centuries to teach the lesson again. If you watched this far, it's because this story found something in you that recognizes the weight of history and the cost of war. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and understand who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. If this narrative moved you, if you felt the humidity of the jungle, the weight of the equipment, the fear of the unseen enemy, then take a moment to like this video. That simple action tells the algorithm that stories like this matter, that history told with honesty and respect deserves to be heard. And if you know someone who needs to understand what Vietnam truly was, not the Hollywood version, not the political talking points, but the raw human reality of young men facing the limits of everything they believed, then share this video with them. Pass the story forward, the way soldiers once passed letters home. The men who fought in Vietnam carried burdens that most of us will never understand. They walked into jungles that swallowed light and hope. They called upon firepower that could reshape the earth, and they watched it fail against an enemy that measured victory in survival rather than conquest. They learned at terrible cost that there are some things technology cannot solve and some enemies bombs cannot defeat. They learned that wars are won and lost not in the calculations of generals, but in the hearts of ordinary people. They learned that firepower, for all its devastating power, is only a tool, and a tool is only as effective as the hand that wields it and the purpose that guides it. These lessons echo still, across decades and continents, wherever powerful nations confront the stubborn resistance of people fighting for something they believe in more than life itself. The jungle stands today, green and patient, keeping its secrets. The war is history now, studied in classrooms and debated by scholars. But for those who were there, for the Americans who served and the Vietnamese who endured, it will never be just history. It will always be memory, vivid and painful and true. Subscribe to this channel if you want to continue this journey through history. Not the sanitized version, but the real story of how wars are fought and why they are won or lost. There are more lessons waiting to be learned, more truths waiting to be told. The jungle remembers everything, and now, so do you.